It was one of those afternoons where the silence of the house felt more oppressive than comforting. Lily, my wife, had left for a weekend trip with her friends, leaving the house empty and echoing. Normally, I would appreciate the peace and quiet, but today, it made me restless. I couldn't escape the thoughts that had been gnawing at me recently. Thoughts about someone I shouldn't be thinking of. Those thoughts were about Amelia, my mother-in-law. It was wrong, I knew that. But something about her had been lingering in my mind for months now. Amelia was beautiful. Anyone could see that. Her elegant posture, her graceful movements, and her striking gray eyes made her stand out in any room. Her long auburn hair seemed to always fall perfectly, and the subtle confidence she carried with her only added to her allure. I had known Amelia for years, but lately, our interactions had started to shift. There were moments, subtle but unmistakable, where the air between us felt heavier. At family dinners, during conversations, her eyes would meet mine, and for just a second too long, it felt as though something unspoken hung between us. It was nothing overt, but I couldn't deny that there was some invisible force pulling me toward her. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than a stray thought, an attraction that would fade. But as time passed, I couldn't stop myself from thinking about her more and more. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she interacted with me. The way her laughter seemed brighter when I was around, the occasional touch of her hand on my arm that lingered just a second too long. Each moment felt charged with an intensity one hadn't felt before. That Saturday afternoon, the weight of my thoughts became unbearable. I had tried distracting myself, flipping through channels, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind busy. But nothing worked. My thoughts kept circling back to her. I knew I needed to clear my head, to escape this spiral. But before I realized it, I had already grabbed my keys and was heading out the door. The drive to Amelia's house felt like a blur, my heart racing the entire way. What was I doing? What would I even say? I could tell her I was just checking in, making sure she was okay since her husband was away on business. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I needed to see her. I needed to feel that pull between us again, to see if it was all in my head or if there was truly something there. When I pulled up to her driveway, the familiar sight of her house made my pulse quicken. I hesitated for a moment, sitting in the car, gripping the steering wheel as if it would somehow anchor me to reality. This is insane. I thought about turning back, driving away, but the thought of leaving now felt impossible. I stepped out of the car, the stillness of the street only adding to the tension that was building inside me. I walked up to her front door, the familiar path that felt so different now. The door was unlocked, as it often was when she was expecting someone. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the living room, but there was no sign of her. The house was quiet, too quiet, and then I heard it, the sound of running water coming from upstairs. My heart hammered in my chest. She's in the bath. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked out. But my feet carried me toward the stairs, the sound of the water pulling me closer. My mind was racing, screaming at me to stop, to think this through. But before I knew it, I was at the top of the staircase, standing outside the bathroom door. The smell of lavender bath salts drifted through the air, and for a moment, I stood there frozen, my hand hovering over the door, unsure of what to do next. My pulse pounded in my ears, and without thinking, I knocked softly on the door. "Amelia?" My voice sounded shakier than I intended. There was a brief pause, and then I heard her voice through the door. "Yes." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I just wanted to check on you. Are you okay?" Another pause, longer this time. I imagined her sitting in the tub, surprised to hear my voice outside the door. The sound of water shifting told me she was moving. And then she answered, her voice calm, almost inviting. "I'm fine, just taking a bath." Her tone was casual, but there was something in the way she said it that made my chest tighten, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have walked away. I should have left it at that. But instead, I found myself asking, "Do you mind if I come in for a minute?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I was sure she would tell me no, tell me this was inappropriate. But to my shock, her voice came through the door, soft but clear. "Come in." Those two words sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I pushed the door open, stepping inside as steam filled the room. The bathroom was warm and dimly lit, and there she was, reclining in the tub, her head resting against the edge. Her auburn hair was damp, sticking to her skin in soft curls, and the warm light made her skin glow. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't know what to say or do. But then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my heart race even faster. "Just checking on me, huh?" she teased, her voice soft, but carrying a hint of amusement. I felt my pulse quicken, my palms sweating as I forced myself to speak. "Yeah, just wanted to make sure you didn't need anything." She chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. "I'm fine, but you can stay if you want." Her words were simple, but the way she said them was anything but. I should have walked out, thanked her, and left. But the tension in the air between us was palpable, and I couldn't move. My body refused to listen to the rational part of my mind. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. "Yes, I think I could use some company." That was all the encouragement I needed. The moment she said those words, I felt the last thread of resistance snap. I was stepping into a moment that I knew would change everything, but I couldn't turn back now. Slowly, I walked further into the bathroom, the warmth of the steam wrapping around me like a cocoon. I stood beside the tub, looking down at her as she gazed up at me with those piercing eyes, waiting, almost daring me to make the next move. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice low, my heart racing. The question slipped out before I could stop it, but I didn't regret it. Amelia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smile. "If you think you can handle it." I didn't hesitate. My hands moved on their own, pulling my shirt over my head and tossing it onto the floor. I could feel her eyes on me, watching every movement, and the intensity of her gaze sent heat coursing through me. My breath was shallow as I unbuttoned my jeans, slipping out of them and stepping closer to the tub. The space was tight, forcing us to sit close, our legs brushing under the water as I lowered myself in beside her. The sensation of her skin against mine sent a shockwave through me, and I had to stifle the shudder that threatened to break free. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse racing. Every breath I took felt heavy, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. But I didn't want to break the silence, the anticipation, the electricity between us. It was too intense to ruin with words. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "So, what's the real reason you're here, Luke?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a teasing note that told me she already knew the answer. Her leg brushed against mine again, this time more deliberately, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me. I hesitated, my mind racing. I could lie, tell her I was just checking in, but we both knew that wasn't true. We both knew why I was really there. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," I admitted, my voice raw, the confession hanging in the air between us. Her expression softened, and she leaned in just a little closer, her hand brushing my arm under the water. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, like electricity sparking under my skin. "I've been thinking about you too," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. That was it. Those were the words that broke whatever last thread of control I'd been clinging to. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips finding hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was brief, just a brush of our mouths, but the effect was instant. Heat surged through me, and I felt my pulse quicken even more. I pulled back, my heart racing, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. Her eyes were dark, her breathing shallow, and the desire that filled her gaze was unmistakable. She didn't wait for me to make the next move. Her hand slid around the back of my neck, pulling me back to her, and our lips met again, this time with a hunger that had been building for months. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent, desperate, as if all the tension and unspoken words that had lingered between us for so long were finally spilling over. Her body pressed against mine, her fingers tangling in my hair as the water splashed softly around us. I pulled her closer, my hand slipping under the water to rest on her waist, feeling the soft curve of her skin beneath my fingers. She let out a soft, breathless moan against my lips, and it only made me want her more. We broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, both of us panting, the air between us thick with desire. "This is wrong," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I know," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "But I don't care." She let out a shaky breath, her hand still resting on the back of my neck. "Neither do I." Once those words were spoken, there was no going back. Every ounce of reason that told us we should stop, that this was crossing a line we could never uncross, was drowned out by the intensity of the moment. I kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the way her lips felt against mine. The rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of us, lost in the heat of our desire. My hands roamed over her body, finding the soft curves of her waist, her hips, feeling the way her skin heated under my touch. Every movement, every small gasp that escaped her lips, only fueled the fire between us. She leaned back against the edge of the tub, pulling me closer until I was hovering above her, the water splashing softly as we moved. Her eyes were locked on mine, filled with the same desperate need that was burning inside me. I kissed her again, my lips trailing down her neck as her fingers dug into my skin. The room seemed to spin around us, and for a brief moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. For what felt like hours, we stayed tangled together, our bodies moving in perfect sync. Every touch, every kiss, every breath felt electric, like I was on fire from the inside out. We lost ourselves in each other, the world outside the bathroom slipping away. Eventually, we found ourselves lying in the cooling water, our bodies entwined, both of us breathless. The reality of what we had done was starting to settle in, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge it yet. I stared up at the ceiling, my heart still pounding as I tried to process the fact that everything had just changed. "This changes everything," she whispered after a long silence, her voice barely audible over the sound of water dripping from the faucet. I nodded, still unable to fully wrap my mind around it. "Yeah, it does." She shifted beside me, resting her head on my chest as her fingers traced lazy patterns on my skin. "What do we do now?" I sighed, closing my eyes as I tried to think. What do we do now? How could we possibly go back to the way things were? There was no undoing what had just happened. No pretending it didn't change everything. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice heavy with the weight of it all. "But we'll figure it out." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers stilling on my chest. "Do you regret it?" I opened my eyes, looking down at her. Her expression was vulnerable, her normally confident demeanor stripped away, and it made my chest tighten. I reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair away from her face. "No," I said firmly, meaning every word. "I don't regret it." Her eyes softened, and she let out a small breath of relief. "Me neither." We stayed in the cooling water a little longer, both of us lost in our thoughts, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily in the air between us. I could still feel her body pressed against mine, the warmth of her skin, and the lingering taste of her lips. But the reality of the situation was starting to settle in. I knew we couldn't stay like this forever. Eventually, we both climbed out of the tub, drying off in silence. I watched her wrap a towel around herself, her eyes avoiding mine as she quietly moved around the room. There was an unspoken tension now, different from the one before. I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but I wasn't ready to walk away. "I should probably go," I said, my voice breaking the silence. She nodded without looking up, her hands busying themselves with folding the towel, though I could see the tension in her movements. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." I pulled on my clothes slowly, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. The room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as I realized that nothing would be the same after this. But even as I prepared to leave, part of me couldn't let go. Just as I reached the door, I turned back, my voice soft. "Amelia, this doesn't have to be the end." She looked up at me then, her gray eyes meeting mine for the first time since we'd stepped out of the tub. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension still thick between us. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same mix of guilt and desire that I felt gnawing at me. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the towel tightly. "But we need to be careful." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll call you later." Without waiting for a response, I left, closing the door behind me and walking quickly to my car. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the house, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain: things were about to get a lot more complicated. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Amelia. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, felt her touch, and the memory of that afternoon played over and over in my mind. Even when Lily returned from her trip, I found it impossible to focus on anything else. Guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't enough to make me stop thinking about her. Amelia and I didn't talk for a few days. We both needed space, time to process what had happened. But the tension between us didn't fade. If anything, it only grew stronger. Every time I thought about her, about the way we had been together, I felt that same pull, that magnetic force drawing me back to her. A week later, we found ourselves together again. It was a family dinner. Lily and I had been invited to Amelia's house along with the rest of the family. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. We hadn't spoken since that afternoon, but I could see it in her eyes the second she greeted us. She was thinking about it too. As the evening wore on, I did my best to avoid being alone with her. It wasn't easy. Every time our eyes met across the room, I felt my pulse quicken, and I knew she felt it too. But with the house full of family, there was no way we could address the elephant in the room, until we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. It was late, and most of the family was gathered in the living room, talking and laughing over dessert. I had gone to the kitchen to grab more wine, and Amelia had followed, under the pretense of helping. But the moment we were alone, the tension between us snapped back into place, thick and suffocating. "You've been quiet," she said softly, setting down the dish she was holding. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I set the bottle of wine on the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I let out a slow breath. The kitchen felt too small, too intimate. I could feel her presence beside me, every inch of space between us charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "Are you avoiding me?" she asked, stepping closer. I turned to face her, and the second our eyes met, it was like a floodgate opened. Everything came rushing back. The feel of her skin, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her body pressed against mine. My pulse raced, and before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her eyes softened, and she closed the distance between us in one swift movement. Her hand reached out, brushing against mine, and the simple contact sent a shockwave through me. "Neither can I," she whispered. In an instant, the tension between us exploded. Before I knew what was happening, we were kissing again, this time with even more intensity than before. The world around us disappeared, and I pulled her close, my hands finding her waist as our lips moved together with a desperate hunger. There was no hesitation now, no second-guessing. We had already crossed the line once, and there was no reason not to do it again. My mind was a blur of desire, every rational thought drowned out by the heat of the moment. All that mattered was the way she felt in my arms, the taste of her kiss, the undeniable pull between us. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound of footsteps from the living room broke through the haze, snapping us back to reality. We pulled apart, breathless and flushed, the sudden intrusion of the outside world bringing a wave of guilt crashing down on both of us. Amelia's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow, and I could see the panic flicker across her face as she took a step back. "This is getting dangerous," she whispered, her voice shaky. I swallowed hard, my heart still racing. I know. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the tension still crackling between us, but the reality of the situation weighing heavily on our shoulders. We had crossed a line again, and it was becoming harder and harder to pull back. "We need to be more careful," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, knowing she was right. But even as we stood there, trying to collect ourselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. "We can't keep doing this," she added, but there was no conviction in her voice. She didn't believe it any more than I did. "I know," I said again, though deep down I knew that stopping was the last thing I wanted. Before either of us could say anything else, the sound of voices from the living room grew louder, and we both hurriedly busied ourselves with the wine and dishes, pretending nothing had happened. But the truth was, we both knew we were on a dangerous path, one that was only going to get harder to walk away from. The days that followed were filled with a kind of unbearable tension. Every moment I spent around Amelia felt like I was walking on the edge of a knife, balancing between the magnetic pull I felt toward her and the consequences that loomed over us. We tried to stay away from each other, but it was like being trapped in a cycle we couldn't escape. Every time we met, whether at family gatherings or by chance, the air between us would crackle with the weight of everything unsaid. A few days after that heated moment in the kitchen, I found myself at Amelia's house again. It wasn't planned. In fact, I had been trying to stay away, to focus on my life with Lily and pretend that everything was fine. But my thoughts kept circling back to her, to Amelia. The tension, the desire, the guilt. It was all still there, swirling inside me, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before I caved. It was late in the evening when I showed up at her door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, wondering if I should turn back. But before I could decide, the door opened, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of me. "Luke," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing here?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I hadn't planned on coming, hadn't thought about what I would say if I did. But now that I was standing in front of her, the words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw the same conflict in her eyes that I had been feeling. She stepped aside, allowing me into the house without a word. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air between us shifted again, that familiar tension wrapping itself around us like a heavy blanket. The door clicked shut behind me, and we stood there in the entryway, the silence between us thick with everything we weren't saying. I could feel her gaze on me, searching my face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe a reason to stop. But neither of us moved. "I thought we agreed to be careful," she whispered, her voice shaking just slightly. "We did," I replied, my throat tight. "But I can't stay away." Her gaze held mine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The tension crackled between us, more intense than ever, until finally, she took a small step forward. The distance between us shrank, and I could feel the heat of her body just inches from mine. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But even as she said the words, her hand reached out, brushing against my arm. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you really want to stop?" She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a long moment. I could see the battle going on inside her, the same conflict that was tearing me apart. And then, slowly, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't." That was all it took. In an instant, the last of my restraint crumbled, and I closed the distance between us, my lips crashing down onto hers in a kiss filled with months of pent-up desire and frustration. Her arms wrapped around my neck, pulling me closer, and I could feel the way her body responded to mine, the heat between us building with every passing second. We stumbled back into the living room, our hands fumbling to pull each other closer, the tension between us finally breaking free in a rush of passion that we couldn't control. Her fingers tangled in my hair, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I pressed her up against the wall. It was wild, reckless, and completely out of control, and neither of us wanted to stop. For the next few weeks, Our secret affair continued. We met whenever we could, sneaking moments alone, our desire for each other growing with every encounter. But with every stolen kiss, every whispered promise, the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder that what we were doing was wrong. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before we were found out, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Amelia felt it too. The more time we spent together, the more distant she became, as if she was slowly pulling away, trying to protect herself from the inevitable fallout. We never talked about it, but the tension between us began to shift, taking on a darker, more desperate edge. We were both trapped in a situation we couldn't escape, and we both knew it. One evening, after yet another family gathering where we had exchanged secret glances across the room, I found myself at her door again. This time, she didn't hesitate to let me in, but there was something different in the way she looked at me, something sad and final. "We can't keep doing this, Luke," she said softly, her voice filled with a heaviness I hadn't heard before. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "I know." She took a deep breath, her eyes searching mine. "It's going to destroy us. You know that, right?" I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I don't care." But even as I said the words, I knew that wasn't true. I did care. I cared about what would happen if we got caught, about what this would do to Lily, to her husband. I cared about the life I had built, the life that was crumbling beneath my feet because of my desire for this woman. And I could see the same fear in her eyes. She stepped closer, her hand resting on my chest. "We have to stop, Luke, before it's too late." I stared down at her, my heart aching with the weight of it all. I knew she was right. I knew we couldn't keep doing this, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around us. But the thought of letting her go, of never feeling her touch again, was unbearable. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, my voice breaking. She smiled sadly, her fingers trailing down my cheek. "You already have." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. She was right. No matter what happened, no matter how much we wanted to keep pretending, we had already lost each other. This affair, this secret we had been hiding, had already ruined whatever chance we had at being together. I kissed her then, one last time, pouring every ounce of emotion I had left into that kiss, knowing it was the end. She kissed me back, her arms wrapping around me, but I could feel the finality in it, the way she was saying goodbye. When we pulled apart, we stood there in silence for a long moment, neither of us knowing what to say. The air between us was heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. "I'll always care about you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But this it has to end." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I know." With that, I turned and walked out of her house, my heart heavy with the weight of what we had lost. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with the crushing pain of losing her. It was over. It had to be. But even as I told myself it was done, a part of me knew that the memory of Amelia, of what we had shared, would haunt me for the rest of my life.